Oregon fans, what's going on? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. Just in case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks on Fan Nation, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. Appreciate you guys taking some time out of your day to talk some Duck football with me. We got a big show for you guys in store. But before we get to that, quick reminder, do me a favor, take a second out of your day, hit that like button, like the video, and subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts on Dan Lanning hiring Alique Terry as the new offensive line coach for the Oregon Ducks football team. That is the focal point of today's episode. We're going to be breaking down the hire from every angle, talk about who Alique Terry is and what he brings to this Oregon football program. That's how we say it around here, program. You guys know that's how Dan Lanning likes to say it. So, we gotta trickle it over into the podcast. So let's get into this. So the news coming out on Valentine's Day, Tuesday, February 14th. It is Wednesday, February 15th as I record this, and we're going to be breaking down this hire. Let's talk a little bit about who Alique Terry is. We're going to run through some of his previous coaching stops. He most recently coached on the Minnesota Vikings at the NFL level as an assistant defensive line coach, which I think I'm actually going to go through the stops, and then I'll kind of talk about why I think his experience is such an asset for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks, for Will Stein and this offense and beyond. So coached on the Vikings, and then before that, he was the offensive line coach at Hawaii in 2021. And then before that, he was a graduate assistant working with the offensive line at Oregon from 2019 through 2020. So 2 seasons at Oregon. He's a guy who is familiar with Eugene. So that's his most recent, that's pretty much his whole coaching history, his whole coaching resume, because he played his last down of college football just 6 years ago in 2017. He's originally from the Miami area. He was an offensive lineman in high school, and then he played his college football for the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, where he got his start in coaching. I believe it was a quality control coach. So I'm just double checking that. I'm pretty sure he was. Let me see. Come on. I'm trying to find it. All right. Well, he got his coaching start at Wake Forest, where he played. So that's basically the point that we were getting to. But let's just talk about this coaching experience. I think when you see an assistant defensive line coach get hired to coach the offensive line, it kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit. Not shake your head, but scratch your head a little bit. Why would Dan Lanning hire an assistant defensive line coach? Well, I think it kind of answers that. You answer that question when you look at the rest of his coaching resume, some of his other coaching stops before he returned to Oregon. I think starting things off with why I think it's valuable that he has that NFL coaching experience. Starting off, he has experience at all levels. He was a high school player, a college player, coached in college, and coached at the NFL level. So he knows what it takes to get to the NFL. He knows what it's like to be around defensive linemen. I wrote a story over on Ducks Digest just kind of outlining a little bit about who Alique Terry is and, kind of hitting on some points of his experience and kind of how this is a good situation. And basically what I was getting at with that NFL point is that he's around NFL defensive linemen, so he's learning all the techniques, all the skills, all the moves that NFL defensive linemen use to attack the offensive line. So kind of as a result, you can try to kind of factor that in and weave that in to see how you can, counter those moves by the defensive line. So I think in a similar way where you see a lot of guys playing both ways in high school, a lot of linebackers play running back, a lot of cornerbacks play wide receiver. You kind of learn the intricacies. You learn the ins and out of the other side of the ball, of the other position that you're going against. And I think that maybe it's not a direct comparison. Maybe it's not a direct carryover for the defensive line to the offensive line, but I think that's good experience to have. You want to be adding that NFL experience to your coaching staff. And he's young, and he already made it onto an NFL staff, which I think says a whole heck of a lot about the kind of quality of a coach he is, what kind of football mind he is. Because I was talking to someone, around the Oregon program, and I was saying, oh yeah, like I know he's pretty young. He's got to be like, in his early 30s, right? And they were telling me that this is a guy who's closer to like 26, 27. I'm only 25 years old, and this guy just got hired by Dan Lanning. So I was, trying to do a search on his Wikipedia or find a bio to see how old Alique Terry was, but that's kind of what I've been able to gather now. So he's hardly older than me, and he's coaching alongside Dan Lanning, which I think says a lot about the faith that Dan Lanning has in Alique Terry and what kind of a coaching mind he is, what kind of a football mind he is. Keep in mind, obviously there's familiarity with Eugene because Alique Terry was at Oregon on the staff, but there's also familiarity with Dan Lanning because he was actually slated to join Dan Lanning's staff when Lanning was first assembling his coaching staff at Oregon, but then the Vikings came calling, and he ended up going over to Minnesota. So there's some familiarity with Lanning too, which is part of the reason that I listed Alique Terry as, one of my main guys to watch in Oregon's search for an offensive coordinator. So we've talked a little bit about the NFL experience. I want to talk a little bit more about his time on the Oregon staff as a GA from 2019 to 2020. Last year was one of the best years we've seen in terms of offensive line play at Oregon. But even before Adrian Clem came to Oregon, he did a great job. Wish him all the best at the NFL level working with the Patriots. But the bar was pretty high even before Clem got to Oregon. And that was when Oregon's offensive line was dominant, right? You had Alex Mirabal and Mario Cristobal on that staff leading the offensive line. And even though I think the overall on-field product of the team, of the offense in particular, left a lot to be desired in terms of having a good run game and having a good pass game. I think if you've been watching or if you watched Oregon football during those years, you would agree with me that those weren't up to standard, but the offensive line can only do so much. They're not making the passes out there. They're not calling the plays. They're not catching the ball. They're not running the ball. They're just mauling and then putting guys on their backs and just having good blocks. So what I'm saying is that the offensive line was so solid already, was at pretty much an elite level when Alique Terry was at Oregon, and he was getting to learn from some of the best coaches in the profession at offensive line. Alex Mirabal and Mario Cristobal, they are phenomenal offensive line coaches. Miami wasn't great last year, but at Oregon, I think we really saw, what they were capable of putting together. So they're going to get all the credit. They deserve all the credit, or a lot of credit, I should say, for the offensive line that they put together at Oregon in 2019, in 2020. But I was going to say fly on the wall, but fly on the wall doesn't even make sense to I feel like that's not fair. But Alique Terry was in all of that. He was learning from Mario Cristobal. He was learning from Alex Mirabal. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say he probably took a thing or two from his 2 years under those coaches at Oregon. He's probably implemented that into his own coaching philosophy just as a football coach. I bet that there's a lot of things that he learned from his time at Oregon that he implemented when he was at Hawaii in 2021, leading his own offensive line room. I think that that's really important too, that even though he's a young coach, Lanning's not just handing the reins of his offensive line over to some young guy who hasn't done it before. Alique Terry has done it before. He has led his own offensive line room. And sure, Hawaii isn't a college football powerhouse, but that's a Power 5 program. That's a D1 program that I think still brings you valuable experience, getting to go through a whole season, getting to work with another college staff, to understand the recruiting process, which I'm sure he learned plenty about when he was at Oregon. We're going to talk about some recruiting upside later on in this episode, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But I think that all of his experience, that the coaches that he's been around, Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal, that Minnesota Vikings staff, being around multiple levels of football. I feel like that's all just raising the floor and the ceiling, you could argue, for Alique Terry. And I feel like that's kind of what makes him, in part, a very solid hire for Oregon. I'm not gonna say he's a phenomenal coach and he's gonna be the best guy to ever do it at Oregon. I don't want to get ahead of myself. There's still football to be played. There's still, an offensive line rotation that has to be figured out with a lot of new faces. But I'm just trying to kind of explain why I think this is a very high upside hire. It's a very intriguing hire for Dan Lanning, and it's one that I think can pay off a lot. We've talked a little bit about the familiarity with Eugene. This is a guy who knows the ins and outs of Eugene. He knows what it's like as a city, as a college town. He knows what Oregon football means to the Eugene community. He knows the standard. He probably saw what Oregon did last year, and he's been around the room when it was really, really elite during his time at Oregon. When they had 3 All-Americans on the team with Penei Sewell, with Calvin Throckmorton, with Shane Lemieux. Those were some of the best offensive linemen that have come through Oregon in recent years. I mean, you could probably make the argument that Penei Sewell might be one of the best, if not the best, linemen to ever come through Oregon. Maybe I need to look a little bit farther back in my history to fully answer that question. But Alique Terry is coming back to Eugene with a bunch of familiarity, and he's hungry, man. He's hungry to keep elevating that standard, and he knows what it means to meet that standard from his time on the staff at Oregon. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the recruiting upside, because Alique Terry is originally from Miami, and I think one of the things that makes this an interesting hire when you're looking at the recruiting potential is that it kind of gives Oregon an opportunity to more or less pick up where Adrian Clem left off. And let me be clear that I'm not saying Alique Terry is going to be the equivalent of Adrian Clem on the recruiting trail. What I'm trying to say with this point is that Adrian Clem was one of those main guys on the Oregon staff that had those connections in Florida, had those connections in the Sunshine State. You go over in 2023, you look at the recent work that Oregon was able to do in the recruiting trail. You go out and you get Janoris Wilson, an intriguing offensive lineman out of Lakeland, Florida. Same high school as Cormani McClain, the nation's #1 corner. He's heading to Colorado. Janoris Wilson just won a state title with that guy. Janoris Wilson is someone who, he has some background as a wrestler, which I think makes it even more of an upside for him in Eugene. Having guys that know how to, kind of utilize leverage, that have that bend. You talk about bend all the time with edge rushers. Offensive linemen need that too, to be able to kind of counter those moves. So a really, really athletic guy, and Adrian Clem goes into Florida to get him. Adrian Clem extends an offer to 2025 Tampa Bay Tech wide receiver Dallas Wilson. He commits on the spot after getting that offer. That was one that he was very much waiting for, and pretty much saying in the age of social media, if I get that Oregon offer, I'm going to take it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that adding a guy like Alique Terry with those ties to Florida allows you to try to keep some of that momentum bottled up and carry it forward. And at the end of the day, regardless who's on this Oregon staff and regardless of where they're from and where they have those connections, you want to still take those shots. You still want to take those shots at those big guys, at those 5-star guys, at your Samson Okunlolas from last year, all the way out on the East Coast. Your Miles McVay, a guy from the St. Louis area, I believe. There were your Caden Proctors, right? And I think that Oregon was in a really good spot to flip Caden Proctor from Iowa until he went out to Tuscaloosa to visit Alabama and the Crimson Tide. And then that one, when Alabama gets involved, it's hard to contend with Nick Saban and the Tide. But I think that Alique Terry's Florida ties could really come in handy here. I'm not saying that he's going to be, the best recruiter on the staff, but I think that's something more and more the more that I've kind of gotten into this profession and tried to understand the links between recruiting and staff hires. You want to build out your staff with guys that are connected across the country. Or like just looking a little bit closer at this current Oregon staff, right? I'm out in Long Beach in Southern California, and there's a bunch of guys on this staff under Dan Lanning that are connected out here, right? You have Demetrius Martin, who was just named the Pac-12 Recruiter of the Year by 247 Sports. He's from Pasadena. He's a SoCal guy. You have Rashad Wadood, who came over from Long Beach Poly, where the Ducks got Dalen Austin, and they got Roderick Pleasant out of Junipero Serra and Gardena. You have Tosh Lapoy, who's super connected in California and throughout that state. And then you have Will Stein in the new offensive coordinator for Oregon. He's really connected in Texas. That's his area, right? Coming over from UTSA out there in San Antonio. So I think that. And then you also have Carlos Lachlan, who's from Birmingham. Oregon has gotten 2 running backs that are looking really, really promising. And Jordan James, who's already at Oregon and played, from Tennessee, and you have Dante Dowdell in 2023 from the state of Mississippi. So, you see that way that coaches are able to lean into their home areas, the regions that they're connected in. And you also saw with Will Stein going to get Austin Novosad from their connections out there in the Lone Star State in Texas. So it really makes a lot of sense. And I'm not saying that Oregon's going to just ramp up getting a bunch of Florida guys, but you still got to take those shots, and Oregon's going to keep doing that. You're going to have your bread and butter on the West Coast in California. You're going to get those guys out of Oregon when they're at that level. Washington's a state that's showing a lot of upside. Arizona, the whole Desert Ducks movement, that's something that the staff is absolutely prioritizing. You're going to make a living a little bit in Utah, looking for some big offensive and defensive linemen. You have Tavito Pomee, who comes out of the Layton Christian Academy in Utah in the 2023 class. You have Spencer Fano, who was a big-time offensive lineman that Oregon was going after out of the state of Utah, ultimately ended up staying in state with the Utes. But yeah, that's just an interesting dynamic when it comes to recruiting. You've got to keep taking those shots at those big names, those big guys on the recruiting trail, even if they are a little bit of a reach. You've got to give yourself a chance and at least offer them, pursue them, get them out for visits. And I think that Alique Terry helps Oregon do just that. All right, another thing I want to talk about here. The Alique Terry hire, let's rewind that a little bit. The Alique Terry hire is maybe a hire that is representative of a theme that we're seeing early on in Dan Lanning's tenure. And that's a youth movement. That's the only other way you can really put it. I'm not saying the entire staff is super young. Adrian Clem was certainly one of the older members of the coaching staff during his time in Eugene. Tosh Lapoy isn't super old, but he's definitely experienced. I want to say he's in his 40s. Tony Tuioti is another veteran guy. Demetrius Martin is another veteran guy. But Lanning's had to make some pretty big hires, and he has, in large part, he's kind of given a lot of young guys their shot. And it's not a huge surprise because he's young himself. Oregon did give Dan Lanning his first shot as a head coach, saying, hey, I see what you're doing over there at Georgia. I see your impressive track record of developing guys, sending guys to the league, recruiting guys at a high level at Georgia. Come over here and pick up where Mario Cristobal left off. Mario Cristobal definitely laid that blueprint, and you can clearly see Dan Lanning's just taking it to another level. I mean, say what you want about last season and there being some disappointing losses to Washington, to Oregon State, but 10 wins in your first season as a head coach across the country, not even necessarily being a West Coast guy, and signing the top recruiting class in your conference in your first full cycle, that is a darn impressive start. So Dan Lanning got his first shot as a head coach, a very, very young head coach, and now he's kind of, sharing the love, so to speak, right? He's given some of these other coaches their first shot. He has to find an offensive coordinator. Excuse me, I usually mute myself when I cough. Has to find an offensive coordinator, goes out and hires Kenny Dillingham, a young guy from Florida State who, that hire, I think, raised a lot of eyebrows. You didn't really know how it was going to go. I wouldn't say you were doubting it, but I don't think a lot of people would have been shocked if Kenny Dillingham's 1 year in Eugene wasn't nearly as successful as it was, but that wasn't the case. Kenny Dillingham got to Eugene and just tore it up, lit up defenses in the Pac-12 with Bo Nix, revitalized his career. And, Lanning was talking about how when Adrian Clem was getting interviewed, it says a lot about the staff that he's assembled, about the team at Oregon, that, you're doing something right. It speaks highly of your staff when other teams and, other organizations in the NFL ranks are coming in and trying to take a look at your guys. And he was saying, he was talking about this on National Signing Day, I think, or during the National Signing Day show on Duck Insider, I think. I'm trying to remember the right show, but Joey Mack does a great job over there, and you guys should definitely go check out his show if you haven't. He was saying more along the lines of, I want to build my staff with great people, but ultimately I want the coaches that I bring on my team, the coaches that join my squad, to be able to, ultimately get where they want to go. And he's fully aware, even as a pretty young head coach, right, that might mean that Oregon isn't necessarily where everybody wants to go. So I think that his hiring process is obviously very thorough. He's not a coach he knew he had to act fast with this hire, but he didn't rush into it. So we hired Dillingham, who was a young guy. That worked out. And then he needed to find his successor, and he hired another young up and coming coach in Will Stein, who's obviously had some early success at UTSA. And I think he fielded an offense that ranked, within the top 25 in most offensive statistical categories. And then now Adrian Clem leaves, and he has to find another coach, and he's hiring Alique Terry, another young guy. So this offseason represents a test for Dan Lanning. It absolutely represents a test for Dan Lanning because, I remember when Dillingham left, I want to say, or maybe I think it was during early signing period when he was getting asked about the Adrian Clem interviews and all that stuff. And he was basically saying, I brought in some guys that, some people were I'm paraphrasing here. This isn't word for word what Lanning was saying, but he was basically saying, hey, I had to bring in some guys. I found them. I tabbed them as the guys. I thought that they were, the right answer. And those worked out pretty well. And I think he also might have been saying that about the transfer portal guys. But I think my point's getting across, there's reason to be confident in Dan Lanning from the pieces that he's brought in, whether it be from the transfer portal, whether it be to, bolster his coaching staff, to bolster his recruiting staff too. I mean, that's another thing that's super, super important that we have to talk about. We're talking about how he's assembled his coaching staff, but another huge part of, the operation, a huge piece of the puzzle is building out that recruiting staff. And he brought Marshall Malco in, and, anywhere that guy's been, it's just been elite classes, and there's no reason that shouldn't continue at Oregon. And, there's a lot of really strong members of that recruiting staff, too many to name. But, they're doing a bunch of work, busting their tails behind the scenes, getting all these guys out for visits, just the detail on the itinerary, everything that goes into recruiting. There's so many pieces of the puzzle. So this is a huge test for Dan Lanning, just, in today's era of college football, navigating transfers, navigating coaching departures. There's so much on his plate. And I think that he's done a good job so far. I'm not all about, just singing the coach's praises. You got to be critical when there's, mistakes, and, you got to kind of hold coaches to that standard. Right. But so far he's doing the right things. And I think that he's made some moves that should inspire a lot of confidence for Oregon. Just to talk a little bit more about Alique Terry, don't want to get too sidetracked. Look at the talent that he has to work with. I mean, sure, Adrian Clem left after just 1 year, but look at all the pieces that he added. He added Josh Connerly while he was on the staff, and then added, I want to say, 5 or 6 high school offensive linemen from the class of 2023 that are going to be coming to Oregon. Some of them are already enrolled, like Iapani Lalaulu from Hawaii. He's already enrolled. And then you also have to look at some of the guys that Clem was able to add from the transfer portal before he left. And you're looking at Ajani Cornelius and Junior Angelau. So you already have, 2 guys that come in from the portal that should be day one contributors, day one starters. Angelau was a little bit banged up last year, so he didn't play a whole lot, but Ajani Cornelius is one of the most highly coveted names in the transfer portal at that offensive tackle position. So, that's a valuable piece that they wanted to bring in to make sure that Bo Nix had some good protection. I'm sure that was a big piece for Bo Nix coming back. But you got Cornelius, you got Angelau, you have Jackson Powers Johnson, who played a lot last year and is definitely one of the best offensive linemen on that team for Oregon. Probably working on the interior. Maybe he's going to be the next center for Oregon with Alex Forsyth leaving. And then you also have Marcus Harper II, who comes back, and he was a tremendous success for Oregon's offensive line last year. Keep in mind, he wasn't even the guy that was projected to play a whole lot. He came into play because Stephen Jones got hurt, and Stephen Jones is coming back. And Marcus Harper absolutely deserves a seat at the table, in that discussion for someone on that starting offensive line for Oregon. And then, you also have former 5-star number one offensive tackle in the country, Josh Connolly Jr., who played a lot as a freshman in that 14J jumbo formation. He's back too. So I think that this is an awesome situation for Alique Terry to enter, and he has previous connections with some of those guys in that offensive line room from his time at Oregon. Oregon is losing a lot of guys from last season because of the, some guys are graduating, some guys are going into the NFL, exhausting their eligibility, what have you. But this is a great situation for Alique Terry to go into. I don't know if you'd be hard pressed to find a better situation to go into as an offensive line coach at Oregon, even though Oregon's losing so many of its best pieces. The cupboard's not bare, folks. It is far, far from bare. And it's going to be, I think it's just on the trajectory to go up even more, because what do they say about young guys in the era of college football today, in today's college football coaching carousel? Young guys can recruit. Young guys can relate to the players well. He's a former player himself not too long ago. So if these guys will come to him with the challenges that they're facing, being a student athlete, being a college football player, and he's going to be able to identify with those guys and relate to them because he was in their shoes not too long ago. So Alique Terry could get to Oregon, and there's no reason that he couldn't be the hungriest guy on that staff when it comes to recruiting. There's so many big names on that staff as coaches, as on-field guys, and guys that can recruit. There's so many guys that have done it for a long time, and he's just going to look at the people that he's surrounding himself with. That's one of the biggest things that I think really helps Dan Lanning when he's building out this staff, and why he should be confident, even though it's a really young guy. Look at all the people around him. You have Carlos Lachlan, you have Junior Adams, Drew Maringer, Will Stein. Obviously, Lanning's running the whole operation, making sure things are running. So there's just so many reasons that this Alique Terry hire could and should be a success for Oregon and Dan Lanning. I don't want to, I'm trying to think of the expression. I don't want to say anything too early. I'm just saying that I really feel like there's so many reasons why Oregon and Dan Lanning and Oregon fans should be encouraged by this Alique Terry hire. And hopefully that's what you guys are feeling after watching this. I think that there's definitely a reason to be curious. I don't know if skeptical is the right word, because that kind of maybe implies a little bit of doubt, but there's a lot of reasons that this Alique Terry hire could be a massive success for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks. So had a lot of fun breaking things down on this episode of the pod, talking about the Alique Terry hire as the new offensive line coach, for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks. But I think that's going to wrap it on today's episode of the podcast, of the Ducks Dish podcast. Again, friendly reminder, smash that like button on the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You guys can always find me on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the Ducks Dish podcast, and do me a favor, share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, with other Duck fans. Tremendously appreciate your guys' support, allowing me to do what I do, covering Oregon football on the gridiron and on the recruiting trail. Thank you guys so much for listening and taking some time out of your day to talk ball on the Ducks Dish podcast, and we will see you in the next episode.